The last tendrils of asphalt gave way to a gravel track, stones spitting beneath my tires like angry insects. Dust, thick and ochre, plumed behind the old pickup, a fitting banner for this retreat. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the grip a physical manifestation of the resolve that had propelled me across 3 states. This was it. The canvas, the sanctuary, the escape, or so I hoped. The landscape, once rolling hills, flattened into a desolate expanse. Trees, gnarled and skeletal, clung to the horizon, their branches clawing at a sky the color of bruised plums. The air, even through the closed windows, carried the scent of dry earth, dying leaves, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like rust on forgotten iron. My throat felt tight, a familiar constriction that had become a constant companion since the incident, a physical reminder of the silence that now defined my life. Finally, the house emerged from the gloom, a hulking silhouette against the fading light. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a sprawling monument to forgotten wealth and slow decay. Gables clawed at the sky, windows stared like vacant eyes, and the porch, a wide, sagging grin, seemed to welcome me with a silent, mocking invitation. The real estate agent, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, had called it a fixer-upper with character. I'd called it perfect. Its isolation was a bomb, its crumbling grandeur a challenge. My art, stagnant and suffocated for too long, needed this kind of stark, unyielding space to breathe again, or perhaps to die completely. The engine sighed as I cut the ignition. Silence, profound and immediate, enveloped me. The only sound was the wind, a low, mournful keen that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house itself. The melancholic weight I carried felt heavier here, amplified by the sheer emptiness surrounding me. This place, I realized, was not just old, it was tired. I dragged my duffel bag from the truck bed, the only luggage I allowed myself. Everything else, the canvases, the paints, the brushes, they were already inside, delivered days earlier by a taciturn driver who hadn't lingered. Cobwebs, thick and gossamer, draped across the entryway, catching the last shards of daylight. Dust sheets, like ghostly shrouds, covered furniture in every visible room. I navigated through the labyrinthine ground floor, my hand trailing along a banister slick with grime. The house felt vast, too vast for one man. A dining room, still set with a skeletal candelabra, bled into a sitting room where a grand piano sat silent, its keys yellowed like forgotten teeth. I found the kitchen, a cavernous space with a defunct iron stove that looked more like an ancient altar. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned under my weight, each complained a separate voice in a chorus of decay. The bedroom I chose was at the far end of a long, dark corridor, overlooking the overgrown rear garden. It was the largest, with a tall, arched window and a fireplace that had clearly seen better days. I tossed my bag onto the exposed mattress, the springs groaning in protest. As I began to unpack, a faint draft snaked through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. I checked the window, firmly latched. The door was closed. Not dust, not damp, but something like old ozone and something else. Something faintly metallic, like the coppery tang of old blood, but subtler, almost imagined. I shook my head, dismissing it as the house's particular perfume. My mind, I knew, was a treacherous landscape. I decided to explore the grounds before nightfall truly swallowed the light. The rear of the house opened onto a neglected expanse, choked with thorny bushes and skeletal rose trellises. As I pushed through a particularly stubborn patch of nettles, my boot caught on something hard. I looked down, clearing away the overgrown vines. It was a concrete path, cracked and moss-eaten, leading deeper into the woods, away from the main house. Curiosity, a flicker of my old self, spurred me onward. The path wound for perhaps 50 yards, curving around a cluster of ancient oak trees before terminating abruptly. And there it was, a low-slung building almost entirely swallowed by ivy and neglect. This wasn't a shed or a stable or even a guest house. This was unmistakably a defunct bowling alley. My breath hitched. A bowling alley on this desolate, isolated property. It felt utterly incongruous, a bizarre relic from a forgotten life. The smell of ozone was stronger here, mingling with the heavy scent of damp concrete and something else, something cloying and sweet, like stale perfume and old sweat. I pushed open the door, which hung precariously on a single hinge. Moonlight, filtering through cracks in the roof, cast long spectral stripes across what I could dimly perceive as rows of wooden lanes, their polished surfaces dulled by decades of dust. Tenpin machines, like silent, rusted sentinels, stood at the far end, their mechanisms frozen in time. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the same strange, metallic sweet odor. A faint sound, like a marble rolling across a vast, empty floor, drew my gaze to the furthest lane. My eyes strained in the gloom, trying to discern its source. Nothing, and then a flicker, a shape too large to be an animal, too fluid to be a trick of the light. My heart gave a jolt. I stood frozen, my breath held captive in my chest, the peculiar scent now almost overwhelming. It was gone, if it had ever been there. Just the profound, unsettling quiet of the defunct bowling alley, a place that felt less like an abandoned building and more like a waiting tomb. I backed out slowly, the rusty door groaning shut behind me, plunging the structure back into its silent vigil. The house, which had moments ago seemed merely old and imposing, now felt different. It felt aware. My hand, trembling slightly, found the doorknob. This house, this place, it was more than just a setting for my new beginning. It was a beginning of its own, and I was already caught in its current. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the grip a physical manifestation of the resolve that had propelled me for hundreds of miles. The house loomed, a gaunt silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. It wasn't merely old, it felt ancient, its timbers groaning under the weight of untold seasons. Gables, sharp as broken teeth, clawed at the fading light. Windows, dark and vacant, stared like blind eyes. A shiver, not entirely from the evening chill, traced its way down my spine. This was it, my new beginning, or something else entirely. The air tasted of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint metallic tang I couldn't quite place. My boots crunched on the gravel as I approached the porch, each step echoing in the profound quiet. It smelled of dust, of forgotten things, and that same unidentifiable metallic scent. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, painting fleeting landscapes across cobweb-draped furniture under white sheets, and walls papered with patterns faded into abstraction. The silence was not empty. It felt occupied, like a breath held just beyond the threshold of hearing. I moved through the downstairs, my footsteps loud and solitary. The kitchen, vast and empty, held a single rusted cast-iron stove. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of dry leaves against the windows, felt amplified, stretched. I told myself it was just the house settling, the sounds of an old structure rousing from a long slumber. But a subtle tension began to coil in my gut, a thread of unease I couldn't quite sever. I found what would be my studio on the second floor, a large room with tall windows overlooking the desolate, overgrown grounds. I began to unload my supplies, canvases, paints, brushes, the familiar weight of them, a small comfort in this alien space. As I arranged my easel by a window, a faint scrape like fingernails dragging across wood seemed to emanate from the floor below. I froze, head cocked. Nothing. Just the wind, I decided, rattling a loose shutter. My breath hitched. I stood still, listening, every nerve taut. The sound faded, replaced by the relentless sigh of the wind. My mind, exhausted from the drive and the weight of this new venture, was playing tricks. That had to be it. My heart gave a startled thud against my ribs. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast quiet. Only the wind answered, a mournful howl through a distant crack. I snatched up the lantern, sweeping its beam across the room. Empty. Of course it was empty. I was alone here. I had to be. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now, or perhaps it was just my imagination, heightened by the creeping unease. I needed to explore the property, to understand its boundaries, to find some anchor in this strangeness. The next morning, fueled by strong coffee and a forced sense of determination, I began my survey. The land was wild, overgrown with thorny bushes and skeletal trees. Behind the main house, half swallowed by unchecked vegetation, stood a smaller, dilapidated structure. It was an annex of some kind, its windows shattered, its door hanging ajar. Pushing through a thicket of brambles, I stepped inside. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something cloying and sweet like decay. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a long, narrow hall. A few battered, chipped balls lay abandoned in a dusty return chute. This was a defunct bowling alley. A wave of profound strangeness washed over me. Why would anyone build a bowling alley attached to a house like this, so far out in the wilderness? The sheer incongruity of it was jarring, unsettling. It felt profoundly wrong, like finding a perfectly preserved organ in a body that had long since turned to dust. As I peered down one of the lanes, my beam catching the ghostly outline of a scoring machine, a faint, rhythmic thump-thump started, deep within the walls. It was slow, deliberate, like a pulse. My hand tightened on the flashlight. There was nothing. I backed out of the defunct bowling alley, my skin prickling. The feeling of being watched was no longer a fleeting impression. It was a tangible weight on my shoulders. I could feel it when I painted, a phantom presence at my back. I felt it when I ate, a silent witness across the empty kitchen table. It was waiting. And I, Diego, was its new inhabitant. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, the grip a physical manifestation of the resolve that had propelled me across states, away from the ghost of my old life, towards this desolate promise. The house loomed, a jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes. I'd arrived, and now the real work began. Not just the unpacking, but the unearthing. The first few days were a blur of dust and echo. Every floorboard groaned beneath my weight, every gust of wind through a cracked pane sounded like a sigh. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of aged wood, damp plaster, and something else. A faint, metallic tang that snagged at the back of my throat. I ignored it or tried to. This was the raw canvas I'd sought, the isolation I craved to exorcise the paralysis that had seized my art. My initial exploration was methodical. I needed to understand the bones of this place, its nooks and forgotten corners. The main living areas were stripped bare, but the attics and cellars held remnants. In the cavernous, cobweb-draped attic, I found stacks of mildewed furniture, shrouded in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. The cellar, a damp, earthen maw, offered nothing but the oppressive weight of the earth above and the relentless drip of unseen water. It was in the library, a room I'd initially dismissed as merely dusty shelves, that my true investigation began. The air here was stiller, cooler, carrying a different scent parchment and something vaguely acrid like old vinegar. I ran my fingers over the spines of forgotten texts, a thick layer of grit adhering to my skin. Most were classics, their pages brittle and foxed, but behind a false panel in the largest bookcase, a section that felt oddly hollow when tapped, I found it. The panel gave way with a faint click, revealing a shallow recess, barely wide enough for a stack of leather-bound journals and a few loose papers. My breath hitched. This wasn't just dusty history, this was hidden history. The first journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands, lay open to a page dated almost a century ago. I pulled out the journals, one by one, along with a bundle of yellowed newspaper clippings tied with a fraying ribbon. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the first article. Dated 1928, the headline screamed, "Local family disappears without trace." The article detailed the sudden vanishing of the Miller family, a couple and their 2 young children from this very house. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. Just gone. The subsequent paragraph spoke of local speculation, of a curse on the land, of the family's growing despair in the months leading up to their disappearance. My gaze flickered to the journals. They were written by a matron, presumably the wife, Eleanor Miller. Her early entries were mundane, detailing household chores and observations about the changing seasons. But as the pages progressed, a creeping unease began to seep into her elegant script. He says it's my imagination, but the house breathes. I hear it at night, a long, drawn-out sigh from the walls themselves. Then came the mentions of fear, not just her own, but her husband's and even the children's. Little Thomas woke screaming again. My heart aches for him, for the fear in his eyes, and I regret my sharp words from yesterday. It feeds on us, I know it, on our fear, on our failings. My husband's business worries consume him. The children hide their faces, their small joys fading like embers. And I dwell on my mistakes, the chances not taken, the bitter words spoken. The house takes it all. The entries grew frantic, the handwriting jagged and desperate. The final entry dated precisely 1 week before the newspapers reported disappearance. He spoke of the alley, the place of laughter, now of tears. He said it would be the first to fall, then us. We must leave, we must, but the house. It holds us here, it wants our fear, it wants our regret, it hungers. The alley, my mind raced. What alley? The property was vast, but I hadn't seen anything that fit the description. I sifted through the other papers, finding a crudely drawn map, folded and tucked into the back of the last journal. It wasn't a map of the house, but of the surrounding land. A dotted line led away from the main structure, through an overgrown patch of woods, to a small, hand-drawn rectangle labeled, in a leaner, shaky script, the bowling alley. A defunct bowling alley. It wasn't a place of laughter anymore, she'd written, but of tears. The metallic tang in the air felt stronger, sharper, as if the house itself was reacting to my discoveries. I clutched the map and the journal, the leather rough against my palm, and it knew I was here. The metallic tang in the library air sharpened, cutting through the dust and old paper like a blade. A defunct bowling alley. The phrase, scrawled in the journal's fading ink, was a hook in my mind, pulling me from the oppressive gloom of the house. It wasn't a place of laughter anymore, she'd written, but of tears. The words resonated with a cold certainty that bypassed logic, striking directly at a deeper, more primal understanding. I clutched the journal, its brittle pages threatening to crumble, my grip tight against the aged leather. I couldn't stay. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, a silent, predatory sigh. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid like rusted blood. Outside, the night was a vast, ink-high canvas. The wind, a mournful lament, whipped through the skeletal trees, making them claw at the bruised sky. I had vague memories of a dilapidated structure on the property's forgotten fringes, a place I'd dismissed as just another ruin. Now it called to me. The path was overgrown, brambles tearing at my trousers, but I pressed on, the lantern beam dancing ahead, carving a narrow tunnel through the absolute black. The structure loomed suddenly, a skeletal silhouette against the faintest hint of distant starlight. It was larger than I remembered, a long, low building, its roof sagging like a weary spine. The windows were gaping eyes, long since shattered. A wave of profound stillness emanated from it, not the peace of an empty place, but the suffocating quiet of a tomb. The metallic tang was overwhelming here, so potent it tasted like pennies on my tongue. Inside, the defunct bowling alley was a monument to decay. Dust motes, thick as snowflakes, danced in the lantern's beam, illuminated against the vast, cavernous space. The wooden lanes, once gleaming, were now warped and splintered, covered in a fine layer of grime. Pin-setting machines stood like forgotten automatons, their gears frozen in time. The air was a stagnant brew of mildew, stale grease, and that pervasive, sickening metallic scent. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my boots crunching on scattered debris fragments of shattered glass, a solitary cracked bowling pin, its red stripe faded to a ghostly pink. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of my own breath. Then a flicker. Not of the lantern, but a distant, peripheral shift in the gloom at the far end of the lane, near where the pins would have stood. A low scraping sound answered me, like fingernails dragging across a rough surface. It came from behind the counter of the old snack bar, a place choked with cobwebs and crumbling menus. I edged closer, my heart thrumming against my ribs. The sound came again, a rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. my gaze fixed on a small, chipped ceramic bird half buried beneath a pile of ancient scorecards. It was a robin, its blue glaze faded, one wing broken clean off. It was the same robin, the one I'd given to my sister years ago, the one she'd dropped, the one I'd screamed at her for, the one I'd never seen again. As I stared, transfixed, the bird moved. Not a tremor, not a shift from settling dust, but a deliberate slide across the grimy counter, inching towards the edge. The voice was not a sound in the air, but a thought in my mind, yet it carried the distinct intonation of a child's accusation, laced with profound sorrow. My hand trembled, the lantern beam jiggling wildly, but I always knew. My eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing, only the vast, echoing emptiness. The metallic tang intensified, tasting of old pennies and something else, something sweet and cloying like decay. I could feel eyes on me, countless unseen eyes pressing in from the gloom. Then a visual distortion. The far wall, where a faded mural of grinning bowling pins once stood, rippled. The wood grain of the wall behind them pulsed, like veins beneath thin skin. The ceramic bird slid again, this time falling from the counter with a soft clink onto the dusty floor. I flinched, expecting it to shatter completely. But it lay there intact, save for its already broken wing. And beside it, partially obscured by a torn piece of linoleum, was a small, tarnished silver locket. My fingers fumbled with it, the cold metal a shock against my skin. It was hers, the one she always wore. And inside, a tiny, faded photograph of us children smiling before everything changed, before the accident, before the tears. You try to forget, but it remembers. My past, my deepest shame, laid bare in this derelict place. The entity was here, undeniably here, and it was not merely observing. It was reaching, probing, twisting the knife of my regret. The defunct bowling alley was not just a location. It was a stage, meticulously set. A profound, terrifying understanding settled over me. This wasn't just about the house, it was about me. And the entity knew, it knew everything. The air in the defunct bowling alley had turned thick, clinging to my skin like damp ash. The phantom sound of pins crashing, a memory of a memory, still echoed in the hollow space behind my ears. My past, my deepest shame, laid bare in this derelict place. A profound, terrifying understanding had settled upon me. It knew everything. A cold dread far more potent than the chill of the abandoned structure seeped into my bones. This wasn't a haunting, it was a predatory game, and I was the prey. My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. I had to leave, now, not just the bowling alley, but the entire house. The entire God-forsaken property. The determination, a fierce, primal instinct seized me. I didn't look back, I couldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed for escape. The front door, my car, the winding gravel road that led back to anywhere else. The house groaned around me, a symphony of settling timbers and shifting dust. Or perhaps it was something else, something far more deliberate. Focused, Diego just reached the door. The grand, heavy oak door, my perceived exit, loomed ahead. It should have turned. It always turned, but it remained stubbornly fixed, unyielding. I twisted harder, my grip tightening, a desperate grunt tearing from my throat. Nothing. It was locked. Impossible. I never locked it. I slammed my shoulder against the thick wood again and again, the dull thuds echoing through the empty house. The door didn't budge. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning. This couldn't be happening. I spun around, searching for another way out. The windows, there were plenty of windows. I ran to the nearest one, a tall, grimy pane overlooking the overgrown garden. My hand scrabbled at the latch, but it was rusted solid, fused to the frame. I tried another and another. Each one was equally impenetrable, cemented shut by years of neglect or something far more sinister. It was as if the house itself had sealed itself against me. A low, guttural thrum resonated through the floorboards, vibrating up through my feet. It was a sound I'd heard before, deep in the walls, but now it was louder, more insistent. It felt like a pulse, a slow, malevolent heartbeat. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid like old pennies left in stagnant water. Then the visions began. Not hallucinations, not dreams, but stark, vivid memories, unbidden and overwhelming. The face of the old colleague, his eyes wide with betrayal. The shame, the burning, debilitating shame of my failure. The crash of the ceramic, the glint of shattered porcelain. My heart seized, a painful clench. It was all there, laid out before me, raw and bleeding. It feeds. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The fear, the regret, the shame, these weren't just the entity's preferred diet, they were its very essence. It wasn't just present in the house. It was the house, an extension of its will, trapping me within its walls, forcing me to relive the very moments that had driven me to this desolate place in the first place. My trauma wasn't just a weakness. It was a weapon, honed and wielded against me. The house seemed to breathe around me, the floorboards groaning, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of weak sunlight like malignant spirits. It beckoned, not with a promise of escape, but with the certainty of deeper entrapment. I was caught, utterly, irrevocably caught, and the entity, whatever form it truly took, was only just beginning to savor its meal. A cold gust of wind swept through the supposedly sealed room, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of blood and a whisper that slithered into my ear, a name I hadn't thought of in decades. Macias. My stomach churned, a knot tightening beneath my ribs. Macias. No, that couldn't be right. I hadn't known anyone named Macias, had I? The name felt like a splinter of glass in my mind, sharp and insistent, yet completely alien. My breath hitched, caught in the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The house pulsed around me then, a low thrumming vibration that resonated in the soles of my feet, crawling up my spine. It wasn't just the floorboards groaning anymore. It was the very fabric of the structure, alive and aware. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something cloying and sweet like decaying blossoms. My head pounded, a rhythmic throb that matched the house's unseen heartbeat. A low, guttural growl seemed to emanate from the very walls, a sound that spoke of hunger. You left. My mind reeled, trying to grasp at the elusive threads of understanding. What was it talking about? Who had I left? The house wasn't just a place of haunting. It was a key, a conduit, twisting my perceptions, forcing open doors I'd long since bricked shut. A peculiar compulsion seized me, an undeniable pull towards something somewhere. I had to go. I had to find it. The house demanded it. I grabbed my keys, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal, my heart racing a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The old pickup truck roared to life with a reluctant cough, its headlights cutting through the encroaching twilight as I sped down the winding gravel road. I didn't know where I was going, not consciously, but my hand steered. My foot pressed the accelerator, guided by an invisible hand, a memory I couldn't quite touch. The journey was a blur of desolate fields and skeletal trees, the landscape mirroring the barrenness within me. Then through the growing gloom, a familiar shape materialized, half hidden by overgrown weeds and rusted chain-link fence. The vehicle lurched to a halt, dust billowing around me. It was an old building, long abandoned, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light, strikes and spares. A defunct bowling alley. The air here was different, thick and stagnant, heavy with the ghosts of forgotten laughter and the phantom clatter of pins. I pushed open the warped, aluminum door, its hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the silence was absolute, suffocating. The air hung heavy with the smell of stale beer, mildew, and something else, a faint metallic tang, just like the whisper in the house. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating the decay. Overturned plastic chairs lay scattered like fallen soldiers, their once vibrant colors muted by years of neglect. The lanes, once polished to a mirror sheen, were cracked and peeling, resembling the skin of some ancient, diseased creature. My boots crunched on scattered debris, broken glass, discarded scorecards, and something else small and round that gleamed faintly. A bowling ball, its finger holes filled with cobwebs. A sudden sharp image flashed in my mind, the brightly lit lanes, the thud of a ball, the crash of pins, the roar of a crowd. And then a scream. A child's scream. I walked deeper into the cavernous space, my breath catching in my throat. The pins at the far end stood like skeletal sentinels, bathed in the sickly green glow of a broken emergency light. The fall, your fault. My knees buckled. The bowling alley wasn't just a place, it was a stage for a memory I had meticulously buried. I saw it now, not as a vision, but as if I was standing there again, a younger me, barely a teenager. My friend. We were playing, laughing, pushing each other to take risky shots. Macias, daring me to throw a curveball from the wrong line, too close to the pins. I'd refused, I remembered that much. But then Macias had gone instead, mimicking my refusal, a playful taunt. He'd slipped. The sound of his head hitting the lane, the sickening crack, my paralysis, my fear, my flight. I'd run, leaving him there, a small, still form on the gleaming lane, the other children screaming. The entity wasn't just feeding on the general fear and regret in the house. It was feeding on mine. It had drawn me here, to this place, to this precise memory, to force me to relive the moment of my greatest failure, my deepest cowardice. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a predator, cultivating specific, potent emotions. It had orchestrated my arrival at the house, slowly chipping away at my defenses, until I was vulnerable enough to be led back to the source of its nourishment. The pins at the end of the lane began to sway, not from any breeze, but as if an invisible force was toying with them. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floor, growing in intensity, a hungry, waiting sound. The metallic tang in the air grew overpowering, choking me. I could feel its presence now, vast and formless, swirling around me, seeping into the very pores of my skin. It wasn't just in the house, it was in me. And I, like a fool, had watered it. The pins crashed then, all at once, a deafening, echoing roar in the cavernous space, though no ball had been thrown. My knees buckled. The cold, grimy concrete beneath my palms felt like a judgment. The defunct bowling alley stretched before me, a mausoleum of forgotten leisure, its air thick with the ghost of stale popcorn and the metallic tang of decay. It wasn't just a place, it was a stage for a memory I had meticulously buried, a secret I had painstakingly coated in layers of self-deception and the numbing routine of my art. My friend. The memory, previously a blurred photograph, snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. The entity, it wasn't just showing me things, it was forcing me to remember, carving away the protective scar tissue I'd built over decades. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. The single, bare bulb hanging precariously above the lanes flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked the silhouettes of phantom bowlers. The stench of something rotten, like old meat left in a forgotten corner, intensified, making my stomach clench. It was the voice of the entity, a chorus of despair and accusation. The weight of it, the pressure, the choice. My head throbbed. The bowling pins, a scattered array of white phantoms at the end of the nearest lane, seemed to waver, their forms blurring, elongating, twisting into mocking skeletal figures. No, I rasped, pushing myself upright, my legs trembling. The memory surged, overwhelming my defenses. We were at the approach line, daring each other. My friend, always more reckless, had suggested a challenge. Throw the ball from the very edge of the lane, not the approach. A show of strength, a defiance of the rules. I had laughed, egged him on. He'd picked up the heaviest ball, the black one with the chipped surface. He'd leaned out, his balance precarious, a grin splitting his face. Then a sudden tremor in the floor, or perhaps my own fear manifesting as a jolt. He'd stumbled. It hadn't rolled down the lane. It had dropped, not onto his foot, not harmlessly onto the approach. It had fallen onto the fingers of his outstretched hand, trapped against the unforgiving edge of the lane. A gasp tore from my throat. The sound of bone crunching, a sickening snap, echoed in the defunct bowling alley, impossibly loud, impossibly clear. His scream. It wasn't just a memory, it was happening again, reverberating through the cavernous space, slicing through the air like a physical blade. I saw his face, contorted in agony, his eyes wide with a pain that still, decades later, tore at something deep within me. I had frozen. paralyzed by shock, by the sheer, brutal immediacy of it. I hadn't moved. I hadn't helped. Not for a crucial, agonizing second. The entity laughed, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I watched him, didn't I? Watched him writhe. Watched the blood bloom on the polished wood, my dare, my inaction, his broken hand. The defunct bowling alley shifted. The pins at the end were no longer skeletal, they were now mangled, shattered fragments of bone glistening wetly. The smell of copper filled my nostrils, thick and metallic. This was it. The reveal. Not just a vague trauma, but the specific, visceral moment of my failure. My guilt wasn't a general malaise. It was rooted in this singular, terrible incident. My friend had recovered eventually, but the friendship had never been the same. The unspoken accusation in his eyes, the subtle shift in our dynamic, had been a wound that festered, pushing me towards isolation, towards the very house that now held me captive. All this time, my regret, my fear. The air around me grew heavy, pressing in, stealing my breath. It rippled, pulsed, an inverse silhouette against the dimness. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet I felt its gaze, its hunger. My denial, my lies, my endless sorrow, my past, my shame, my deepest psychological wound. It was here in this rotting space, demanding its due. The ground vibrated violently as if something immense stirred beneath the concrete. The bare bulb above flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish completely. This was my fear, yes, but it was mine. This entity had twisted it, magnified it, but it was still a part of me, a part I had refused to acknowledge. And if it was mine, perhaps I could reclaim it. The broken pins at the end of the lane shimmered, twisting into grotesque, reaching fingers. I feed on what I give I, and I'm not giving it to I anymore. The entity shrieked, a sound that grated on my very bones, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and something else. Panic. The defunct bowling alley seemed to buckle under the assault of its fury. Dust rained from the ceiling. The floorboards groaned. The air became a hurricane of invisible force, threatening to tear me apart. I felt the overwhelming pressure, the psychological assault, the entity trying to force me to my knees, to consume me with the horror of my past. But for the first time in years, I wasn't just remembering. I was facing. And I refused to break. The shriek tore through me, not just a sound in the air, but a vibration in my very bones. 1,000 tiny fractures echoing inside my skull. It was raw, furious, and laced with an impossible, sickening tremor of what I recognized, with a jolt that nearly buckled my knees as pure, unadulterated panic. The defunct bowling alley, already a skeletal ruin, groaned in protest. Dust, thick and suffocating, billowed from the ceiling, obscuring the already dim light, turning the air into a churning, gritty sea. Floorboards beneath my feet shivered, protesting the invisible hurricane that ripped through the space, whipping phantom drafts around me, tugging at my clothes, clawing at my exposed skin with icy talons. Then, as suddenly as it began, it simply stopped. The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound, but a heavy, crushing weight, pressing down on my eardrums until they ached. My own ragged breath sounded like cannon fire in the sudden void. The dust, suspended for a moment in the aftermath of the unseen maelstrom, began its slow, inevitable descent, settling like a shroud over every surface. My eyes, gritty and burning, tried to pierce the gloom to find some shape, some lingering shadow of the thing that had just torn at reality. There was nothing. I slumped against a peeling wall, the rough plaster scraping against my cheek. My legs felt like water, my entire body a trembling husk. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the slick sheen of sweat and the grit of the falling dust. Was it over? Had I truly banished it? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, like the dust motes still dancing in the thin shafts of light from the grimy windows. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself away from the wall, my muscles screaming in protest. The defunct bowling alley stretched before me, a graveyard of forgotten leisure. The pins, scattered like bleached bones, lay in disarray. One, a pristine white against the grimy floor, had fallen perfectly upright, staring at me like a silent sentinel. I shuffled forward, each step a deliberate effort, my gaze fixed on the spot where the entity had coalesced, where it had shrieked its final, desperate cry. There was nothing there. Yet as I drew closer, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer caught my eye. It wasn't light, nor was it a reflection. It was more like an absence, a distortion in the very air, a momentary ripple in the heat haze that wasn't heat at all. And then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Not on the floor, but in it. A faint, intricate pattern like a spiderweb etched into the ancient wood, almost invisible unless you knew to look. It pulsed, a barely there thrum, and within its delicate lines I saw a fleeting image, a flash of memory. The splintered wood of a crib, the glint of a silver locket, the frantic, desperate tearing of paper. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a monster I had fought. This was my monster. The entity had been a mirror, a grotesque manifestation of my own unaddressed guilt, my grief, my deepest, most agonizing regrets. The splintered crib, the locket, the torn paper fragments of the trauma that had driven me to this isolated place, the trauma I had tried to bury. The house hadn't merely harbored a malevolent spirit. It had nurtured mine. Its panic, its final, desperate shriek wasn't just rage. I stared at the almost invisible etching, feeling a strange mix of revulsion and understanding. It was a catalyst, a monstrous echo chamber. The defunct bowling alley, this place of past joy and present decay, had been the perfect stage for my internal battle. Leaving the defunct bowling alley felt like emerging from a tomb. The main house, when I finally staggered back into its familiar, unsettling embrace, seemed different, quieter. I wandered through the empty rooms, touching the cold stone, the rough wood, the peeling wallpaper. The house felt sated, or perhaps merely dormant, like a predator that had gorged itself, now resting, waiting for the next meal, the next vulnerable soul to wander into its web. It wasn't friendly, not safe, but it was no longer actively hostile. The malevolence was a part of its very fabric, but the immediate, consuming hunger had receded. My hands, once hesitant, now found themselves reaching for my forgotten art supplies. The canvas, blank for so long, no longer intimidated me. The visions that had tormented me were still there, etched into my memory, but they no longer paralyzed. The horror I had faced, the confrontation with my own inner demons given monstrous form, had scarred me, yes. But it had also forged something new, something resilient. I was raw, exhausted, but alive in a way I hadn't been in years. The shame, the crushing weight of my past still existed, but it no longer defined me. I stayed in the house for another week, not out of fear, but out of a strange, almost morbid curiosity. The house was quiet, yes, but it was a brittle, fragile quiet, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. I knew it wasn't truly over. The entity, my trauma, was not vanquished merely. Contained, dormant, but I had faced it. I had seen it for what it was. When I finally packed my sparse belongings, the house watched me, silent and impassive. I didn't lock the door behind me. There was no point. The house was not empty. It never would be. I had confronted my past, yes. I had fought the monster, but perhaps in doing so I had merely traded one haunting for another. And would it ever truly leave me? They always did.